Welcome, friends, to a presentation on Born Again Queer, a history of evangelical gay activism and the making of anti-gay Christianity. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, we will hear Danny Ballon-Garst interview William Stell on his new book, Born Again Queer. In this groundbreaking historical account, Stell argues that the anti-gay majority in evangelicalism has been less dominant and more vulnerable than previously thought. Stell portrays the work of four evangelical activists who worked in the 1970s and the 1980s to persuade Christians that their churches should affirm the relationships and ministries of gay and lesbian members. By recovering the successes of these evangelical gay activists and the struggles of their opponents, Stell's account transforms how we think about evangelicalism, how we talk about the culture wars, and how we approach both religion in queer movements and queer activism in religious movements. The moderator of tonight's discussion is Danny Ballon-Garst, a scholar of religion and sexuality in the United States, who recently completed his PhD in American religious history at Emory University. Author William Stell, PhD, is a faculty fellow in the Department of Religious Studies at New York University. Now, I am pleased to welcome Danny and William to begin this conversation.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I am thrilled to be in the virtual space tonight with my good friend and colleague, Dr. William Stell, to talk about his new book, Born Again Queer, A History of Evangelical Gay Activism and the Making of Antigay Christianity. As Mark alluded to in his comments, Born Again Queer makes several interesting and important methodological and theoretical interventions in the study of American religions, in the study of sexuality, in the study of queer life. And we definitely want to get into all of that. But before we do, I just want to say a couple prefatory things. One, as Mark mentioned, we will have plenty of time at the end for audience questions. So please, we welcome audience engagement for this conversation. If you have a question as you're listening to our conversation, just pop it in the chat and Isaiah will direct me to that at the appropriate time. The second thing I'll say is if you have not purchased your copy of Born Again Queer, now would be a good time to do so. You can just open a tab on whatever device you're watching or open a new window. I think we might even have dropped a link to the publisher's website in the chat, so you can publish it. You can buy the book there or anywhere else that you would like. I will say, aside from being a brilliant book based on rigorous scholarship, it's also eminently readable. It's written in a way that is accessible and approachable to vast audiences. It's a book that you could easily teach as an undergraduate course and a graduate seminar, but it will also be totally appropriate for a Sunday school class or a book club or a book discussion group. And so I hope everybody in this moment where the study of queer life is under attack in so many directions, it's even more important than ever that we stand together and support each other however we can, including financially in situations like this. And the last thing I'll say is this: today is a celebratory occasion. Not only are we celebrating William's new book, but William, tomorrow is also your birthday. And so on behalf of the LGBTQ
It's true.
It is, yeah, community.
Mere hours from now.
Well, and we get to ring it in with you, which is great. So let's get going. So William, you and I know this, and the audience wouldn't necessarily know this, but you and I have been friends for a while now, since we were baby grad students many years ago. And because of that, I follow you on social media, as any good friend does. And so I know that since Born Again Queer came out just over a month ago, I think it's been about a month and a half, you have been on a whirlwind book tour, traveling all over the country, speaking with audiences, doing podcasts and YouTube interviews. And I know that you've been on the road a lot. So just, I guess my first question to you is, how are you doing after this whirlwind leg of the tour? What has it been like to be on tour and talking to folks about your book? Yeah, how has life been since this book came out last month?
Yeah, thank you, Danny. And I'll start by saying thank you all for being here. Just flipping through scrolling through the attendees list. I'm just so excited and so humbled. And this is just such a unique gathering. There are people here who I have learned from in many different contexts, and we're here from all over the world, and it's just so exciting. So thank you for being here. I have been running around a lot, as you said, Danny, over the last month. In the last month and 3 days, 10 different events on both coasts, in several states, a few states in Middle America as well. That's been a delight. There's just nothing, and people here in this Zoom room know this better than me. Some do. It's just thrilling to write something and share it, and then have people actually, even in this day and age, read it and engage it and want to talk about it. I've got a few events in like bookstore settings coming up once I'm done with this little hiatus in July, the first part of August. But I think every venue that I've talked with so far, every audience that I've spoken with so far has been congregated in a church. And those have been wonderful conversations to have. What I've found is that people seem to really be enjoying the conversation and enjoying what they've read of the book so far. It is interesting to see what expectations folks come into the room with for what the book will be about, especially with the title like Born Again Queer. And I try to, in my opening remarks and my kind of like 15-minute TED talk on these events, say pretty early on, the conversations that I imagine many of you are used to having about religion and sexuality are not precisely the kinds of conversations that I am having, that I'm inviting us to have through this book. This is not a book debating biblical interpretation. This isn't a book debating Christian theology. It's a history of both of those things and more besides. And while there is this focus, as we'll talk about in a bit, Danny, on the 70s and 80s and the rise of this network of evangelical gay activists that really powerful anti-gay evangelical leaders are noticing and clearly afraid of, both in public and in private, and are worrying about, are these folks going to like take over a notable chunk of our movement? It's about that. It's also much more broadly about the history of evangelicalism and homosexuality, queerness from the 50s on. And in getting at that larger history, there's a larger invitation to think differently about histories of religion and sexuality. We'll talk more about all that in a bit, but it's been very gratifying to me to meet all kinds of folks, all kinds of readers coming from all kinds of different places. And for many of them to assume I'm going to explain to them again what the Bible really says about homosexuality, and instead what I will do is show them is how the people they are learning to debate, they haven't agreed amongst themselves over time. The history that has been portrayed as a monolith, as inherent. Anti-queerness is just an inherent part of the evangelical tradition, of evangelical communities. There is, in fact, historically, way more contestation, way more shifts over time, way more vulnerability. And what I've seen is that too can be liberative. That can be a liberating realization, a liberating kind of learning for all kinds of folks, but maybe especially some of these queer and queer affirming folks in these churches that I've been visiting.
Yeah, I mean, so I definitely want to dig in right to the substance of your argument and to the substance of the book's story. Just kind of one more beat on this, because I was trying to think, recently of academic books that were published, again, to such fanfare, right? With so much buzz, with so much public interest. I mean, there's certainly, right, Anthony Petro's recent book, Provoking Religion, Ahmad Green Hayes' book, Underworld Work, Rebecca Davis's new book, First Desire. These are all books that those of us who study religion and sexuality were waiting for, right? We're highly anticipating these new works. But Born Again Queer seems to cut across various audiences, academic and public. And I'm curious what your sense of why that is. If there's something about the moment, is it something about the story of the book or the story of the people who are coming to hear about it? What do you think is happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it seems like evangelicalism and sexuality for quite a long time, for decades really, has been a very popular topic of conversation among not just scholars, but among journalists, among all kinds of communities, evangelical and otherwise. I mean, it's reaching the public in part because, real talk here. I went out and got a contract with a publisher that made clear that they were going to help me reach the public. And even as this is my first book based on my dissertation, so obviously it's making scholarly interventions. I'm coining terms like hermeneutical determinism and culture war making and things that are not coming up in these church talks at all. Those things matter to me. They matter for what I want to say to historians of sexuality, of American religion, of politics in the US. And it was just clear to me from the beginning that because of the public interest, because of the public power of evangelicalism, and because of the, for a while now, utter dominance of homophobia, of anti-queerness within this powerful religious movement of evangelicalism, and because it has just captured the attention for many reasons, good and otherwise, of the public, again, both journalists, commentators, and others, it was going to have that kind of appeal. So I wrote this book to have that kind of appeal. And one illustration here, Deanna, you asked kind of like, how does that work? Or, talking both to scholars and to others. I ended up pretty late in the game, as we were preparing the book, taking all of what were just chapter breaks. There were 6 chapters to this book, pretty standard for an academic monologue, but plenty of chapter breaks along the way. And somewhere, well after Princeton University Press had agreed to publish it, it was like, I'm just going to try something out here real quick. And I'm going to take all those chapter breaks and we're just going to make them chapters. And there will be 4 to 6 chapters within each of these, what were 6 chapters, but what were then 6 parts, what became part 1, part 2, through part 6. And of course, it meant doing a little bit more tweaking, a little bit more whatever, but it was shocking to me how easy it was to tweak in that way and how much more accessible. It's a very small thing, right? But that has made this text to be able to tell people, yeah, it's 275 pages. The chapters average like 7 pages in length. Anyone can pick this up and put it down, be invited to stop, have permission to stop, after they've read for a pretty short period of time. And frankly, I just don't see why more of us, if we in the academy actually want to reach wider publics, this would be a really easy way that I'm happy for anyone going forward to steal and try to make work. It's been very, it seems like it has been very useful, a very successful, simple strategy on my end.
No, that's great because it's an example of a kind of a smaller change that we as scholars can make to reach broader audiences and to make our work more accessible. I think that's the feedback that I've heard from readers as well. Non-academic readers who find, like you said, they can read it and put it down at any point, but also academics who say, like, I can actually teach this because I can assign it in kind of smaller chunks than I would if it were a standard academic monograph. Let's get into the story then, because you kind of brought up some of the main arguments of the book. What is the story that Born Again Queer is trying to tell? Who are the main characters of this story, and what are the major takeaways you want the reader to walk away with?
Yeah. Before we get to the main characters, I'll just say a few sentences about what precedes the main drama. So the main drama is from parts 2 through 4, introducing the main characters and their context. The first part, the first 6 chapters of the book, are what comes before that, are looking at, those chapters are looking at what evangelical discourse on homosexuality and the Bible looked like from mid-century 40s, 50s, as what was initially called the neo-evangelical movement is getting off the ground, what that discourse looks like on homosexuality and how that shifts over the next 2 decades before we even get to a self-identified evangelical gay activism. What we see in the 40s, 50s, as I chronicle in the book, is that homosexuality is a peripheral concern for most evangelical leaders. In fact, and other people like Heather White and others have chronicled this part before. It's mainline Protestant leaders who were talking much more about homosexuality at this period. And there are multiple historical reasons for that. One of the interventions that I offer in this book is that when evangelical leaders do talk about homosexuality throughout the 40s, 50s, the Bible's there sometimes. The Bible's relatively absent compared to what you see from evangelical discourse decades later, from the late 70s especially on. Bible verses aren't being cited anywhere nearly as much as you would think. What is much more apparent is evangelical anti-communism. And part of the book's argument, I won't go into the details here, but the book is making the case with the historical evidence at hand that it is evangelicalism's distinctively severe anti-communism at mid-century. It's a big part of what's laying the foundation for the later development of a distinctively severe anti-gay stance within evangelicalism. Other things matter too. Patriarchy matters, opposition to the civil rights movement matters, all these pieces come in. But the point here, as we're getting into the main drama, the point is that it is simply not as simple. If we're looking to explain evangelicals' homophobia, evangelicalism's anti-LGBTQ positions, it is just not as simple as the Bible tells them so. Or not as simple as, right, well, evangelicals are biblical literalists, therefore they take this stance, or they're biblical inerrantists, or whatever. This is the hermeneutical determinism piece that I talk about in the book, and that perhaps we can talk about more later as we want. Now, the main drama, like I said, parts 2 and 3 and 4 are chronicling the rise over the course of the 70s of an evangelical gay activist network. There are other folks in this network for sure, other leaders. These 4 are the ones who received the most attention, who to my eyes, with the sources at hand, seemed the most successful. And that success is indicated for me as a historian in part by their opposition, in part by the ways in which, as I said earlier, anti-gay evangelical leaders at Christianity Today, at InterVarsity, at quite large evangelical, powerful evangelical institutions are worried about, are concerned about these folks. So again, it's the anti-gay evangelical leaders who are in the mid and into the late 70s talking quite a bit about these gay evangelicals or this gay activism growing within their own institutions. I could say a bit about each of them. But what I want to say first, before I say just a few sentences about each of these main characters in the book, is that they have a lot of similarities and they have a lot of differences. Their similarities include they all come from self-identified evangelical communities, churches, institutions, even as they come from different Pentecostal, Methodist, Presbyterian circles for a while. They come from different circles, but they all end up going to evangelical colleges and universities or Bible schools. And they all end up in some form or fashion being connected to, if not working for, major evangelical institutions, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, for example. And then you have 2 leaders, Virginia Mollicott and Lisa Scansoni, who are just evident insiders of the institutional world of evangelicalism. They are writing multiple books for evangelical presses, dozens of articles for evangelical periodicals. They are both, but Virginia especially, sought after seekers at evangelical, sought after speakers at evangelical colleges, conferences. I'll come back to them. I'll end with them in a sec. But let me say just a couple of things about Troy Perry and a couple of things about Ralph Blair. Now, Troy Perry, I know many of you know quite well, and I actually won't spend too much time talking about this person who, Pentecostal pastor from the Florida Panhandle, is, and it's not even close, the most famous gay activist in the nation in the early years of the 70s. It's not even close just because of media, just because of the kind of attention, the kind of FaceTime he gets with periodicals who otherwise are hardly printing the word homosexual, or at least in only recently begun to talk about homosexuality, who are wary of chronicling developments in gay liberation movements. But Troy Perry is an easy thing to look at, and he's finding the camera anyways, whether or not they want to look at him or not. Troy Perry's faith and life and activism can't be reduced to evangelicalism, but they're certainly inclusive of it. And even as he's doing all kinds of work with all kinds of people, again, around the country, the three folks that I've mentioned are also collaborating with him. They're working together. And they're working to, and here I'll name just one more key similarity between these four people. They are all using characteristically evangelical language, evangelical discourse, the ways they were taught to talk about the Bible, about God, about gender in some cases, sexual ethics in some cases, race in some cases. They still use these discourses in their public work together. I won't say much more about Troy Perry. I know we've got plenty to talk about, Danny. But I will say that those part 2 of the book, 4 chapters in the book, are chronicling not just his activism, but the role of evangelical factions and evangelical features in the MCC more broadly in its first 15 years. And I'm indebted, I'll name right now, there are people on this call, even Doris, people not on this call, Dr. Monique Moultrie, Dr. Lynn Gerber, people who whose work enabled me to write the kind of history that I've written here about the MCC. And maybe we'll talk more about the MCC later. Ralph Blair is a very different kind of activist, a very different kind of evangelical gay activist. Dr. Ralph Blair does not lead marches like Troy Perry does. Ralph Blair hardly shows up. He never shows up to the marches. He hardly ever steps foot in a secular gay space. Dr. Ralph Blair shows up at the debate hall, at the conference, the Evangelical conference, the Evangelical theology conference. Ralph Blair is very particularly focused on reaching a very particular kind of institutional evangelical, a very particular kind of educated evangelical. He founds what is the first nationwide self-identified evangelical organization focused on serving lesbian and gay people and focused on advocating on their behalf. That organization is called Evangelicals Concerned. It gets launched in 1976. Before long, it's got a dozen chapters across the nation, its own little publications, conferences. The organization itself never reaches more than several hundred members, which makes its impact, which makes the threat it seems to pose to much, much, much more powerful evangelical leaders all the more shocking. And I'm giggling here too. I won't give particular examples, but maybe Harold Lindsell, leader of Christianity Today, is writing these utterly paranoid letters to Ralph Blair, weirdly demanding to be told about Ralph Blair's sex life. There's all kinds of bizarro things happening, all kinds of ways in which Ralph Blair, precisely through his deeply evangelical approach, however one wants to define it, arousing such fears among the homophobic powers that be in the movement's institutions.
And I'll just interrupt you very quickly here to say I want to put a pin in that because I actually want to come back to that question about how you are defining evangelicalism and developing that throughout the book.
Yeah.
So, but we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. Just a few sentences real quick about Virginia Mollenkott and Letha Skinsoni. These two women are leaders of the evangelical feminist movement growing over the course of the 70s, key spokespeople for that movement. And what happens over the course of the mid and late 70s is that these two people realize, the same principles, hermeneutical, theological, social, political, and otherwise, the same principles that led us to be evangelical feminists really should also lead us to be gay affirming, to do this evangelical gay activism thing. With that as a shared commitment, they write a book called Is the Homosexual My Neighbor? Published in 1978 by Harper and Row. I make the case that for a number of reasons, this should be thought of as the pinnacle of evangelical gay activism in 1978. It is surprisingly successful at reaching evangelical readers at first. For a few months especially, even the evangelical periodicals that are suspicious of it, in numerous cases are like, these people are from us. Many of us have worked with them before, lauded their work before. Here's what they say. We're a little suspicious for reasons ABC. But there seems to be in a lot of the early discourse on Is the Homosexual My Neighbor a surprising openness that could this too be a part of the diversity of thought within evangelicalism? At the very least, couldn't we agree to disagree with these, our evangelical siblings? And I chart in the book the turn that happens, especially by the time we get to 1979, 1980, along with larger turns happening within evangelicalism and within American politics, religion and politics broadly. But they are a fascinating case study. Their collaboration, their co-authored book, is a fascinating case study in both the rise and the fall of evangelical gay activism.
Yeah, so part of what the book does so well is to trace, right, the histories of this set of evangelical gay activists, who are making the same types of biblical arguments, rhetorical arguments, right, discursive arguments that their evangelical counterparts are making. And you chart very clearly like how that causes a kind of panic, right? In a lot of the conservative Christian characters in the story very clearly have a conclusion they're trying to get to, and they're just trying to figure out how to get there, right? Which scriptures can they rely on? And then that, gets troubled by biblical study scholarship. So they have to like find a different rationale, which I think is like where, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's part of where your argument is about, to the making of anti-gay Christianity, or what is that piece of the argument, that piece of the subtitle?
Yeah, certainly I'm not arguing that before the 1970s or before the 1950s, that evangelicalism was this safe haven for queer people. Certainly, religious homophobia existed and frankly flourished in evangelical circles in the 1950s and before, insofar as we can talk about homophobia, however far back we choose to do that. If for no other reason than because evangelicalism was prone to patriarchy, as plenty of other scholars have shown, it was also going to be prone to homophobia. Here's the issue, though. In the 1950s, there's really nothing special about evangelical homophobia. Sure, evangelicals are homophobic. So is what? The rest of American Christianity? So is America. And so what needs to be explained isn't why evangelicals became homophobic. What needs to be explained is why this whole religious movement chose to define itself to make as a litmus test by the time we get to the 90s, 2000s. This is one of, if not the dominant litmus test that evangelicals are using to say, are you an evangelical or not? Are you a Christian or not? That's weird. That litmus test is not inevitable, and that's what has to be made. And as you were saying too, Danny, part of what the book is showing is how even as evangelicals have been taught well to respond to, well, why is your opposition to homosexuality central to your faith? Well, the Bible says so. There are all kinds of ways in which one could respond to that. Theologians, biblical scholars will have their ways. What I'm saying is, it's interesting because the way you were interpreting, let's say, Genesis 19 or Leviticus 18 or Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians 6, looks shockingly different, even contradictory from how the person who was leading your organization or editing your magazine 20, 40 years ago interpreted it. Both of you were very clear in your rhetoric of clarity, in your literalist rhetoric. The Bible's clear. Genesis 19 shows that homosexuality is a sin. And then, you've got your neighbors here using the exact same language, the exact same deploying the exact same rhetoric, invoking the same beliefs, making a conflicting and even again contradictory argument. So tracing that is a really important part of making the argument that, again, the making of anti-gay Christianity is always going to be about more than biblical interpretation. It's always going to be about more than just the Bible tells them so.
No, that's exactly right. Right. I read in your story. It's a story. It's a story of power as much as it is a story of persuasion. Right. In the sense that part of what you trace in the making of anti-gay Christianity is how in the 1980s and then the 1990s, evangelical power brokers who control the media, whether it's televangelism or bookstores, they just stop engaging with people like Ralph Blair and Virginia Mollenkott. And in a way, kind of like write their biblical, theological, historical analysis like out of public narrative in a way that like erases it and makes it seem, Matthew Vines and Justin Lee come along in the 2010s, makes it seem like it's brand new. When in fact they're actually making the same arguments, right? That had been made 50 years before.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, go ahead.
Well, what you just said at the beginning there, Danny, is reminding me. I don't say this anywhere in the book, although I hope to close, and I know to some readers of the book it is landing. Um, it's not just this book isn't primarily about this network of evangelical gay activists, even though they're a very important part of the book's story. And it's also not that the book is just about, right, like the history of evangelicalism and homosexuality. At the end of the day, this book is about historicizing religious anti-LGBTQ positions wherever they're found, in and outside of evangelicalism. And ultimately, this is a book about how evangelical power works. Um, and maybe that's a good transition into, you said you wanted to talk about what I mean by an evangelical. Where are we on time? Do we have time to tackle that, or should we save that for later?
We have plenty of time. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about it. Do you want to preface the question or elaborate on the question at
Yeah,
all?
yeah.
Or
I mean, yes. I would like to know how you're defining evangelical in this text, partly because I think you have a theory of what evangelical is that is very different than how most people think about it. And that theory of what evangelicalism is really about only comes through when you read the different sets of stories: the evangelical gay activists, the conservative evangelicals, and then the last section, the progressive evangelicals. Yeah, you can only fully understand your theory of evangelicalism when you see these stories side by side. So, what is your idea about what an evangelical is that you're developing in the book, and how is it different than how most people understand that? And why does
yeah,
it
I
matter?
love.
And why does it matter?
Yeah, I love that, Danny, and I love. I'll reiterate. Um, you got to read the last part of the book. That sixth part really is a crucial cog here. Yeah. So in some ways, my approach, it is distinct, but it really begins with things that other scholars have been saying for 10 or 15 years, quite well. Um, a lot of scholars of evangelicalism have been saying, we have been problematically reliant when we've gone to define this movement. We've been problematically reliant on what are called belief-based definitions of evangelicalism, the most prominent one being often called the Bevington Quadrilateral. What a number of scholars of evangelicalism have been saying is that those criteria and variations on them are problematically vague, are weirdly deployed in service of very particular theological agendas, even as there's something there. Certainly, we can track some communities that are calling themselves evangelical or called evangelical are more likely than others to talk about atonement in certain ways, or maybe more likely to emphasize the practice of evangelism on average than you see elsewhere. But again, there's plenty of problems here conceptually, analytically. What scholars have been saying long before me is we should try to historically ground this movement more. Maybe there's something that we should be calling evangelicalism happening in the 18th century, 19th century. Maybe, sure, I'm not opposed to that. But there's something distinctive happening in the 20th century US. There's something distinctive happening with institutions, with communities forming over the course, first in the fundamentalist movement, but then another iteration of these same leaders and their followers and new institutions emerging at mid-century. This is why I start in the 40s, 50s. This is what is initially called the neo-evangelical movement that will, within 10 or 15 years, shed that label totally and just call themselves evangelicalism. And into the 21st century, I think as a historian of the 20th century US, it makes sense to think of this as, right, institutionally, historically grounded. This is evangelicalism. Anyone who is connected to these institutions in some form or fashion, and anyone who is using their discourses is an evangelical, whether they recognize it or not, whether they would identify themselves as such or not. But here's the analytical intervention that I make. So I borrow that from other people. What is striking to me, in some ways, where I'm not interested in, certainly not primarily interested in solving once and for all, what is the right way to define evangelicalism? What is an evangelical? What's much more interesting to me as a historian of discourse, particularly, is just how much people are fighting over it and just how circular those fights seem to be. What's up with that? What are they fighting over? And here I build primarily on a wonderful historian, Linford Fisher, writes a wonderful article in I can't remember the name of the journal right now. I can't remember where he published it, but Linford Fisher writes a wonderful article somewhere called Evangelicals and Unevangelicals, the contested history of a word. And he makes the argument that from the 16th century German, when Martin Luther is launching what we call the Protestant Reformation and coining the German version of this word evangelical, from then up into the 21st century, we see just a few very consistent usages of this term evangelical. And the one of his that I take and then build on and grow in my own way, he calls it the true Christian usage of the word evangelical. And the way I illustrate this when I talk with churches is I say, imagine you've heard someone say, maybe you yourself have at one point said, I'm an evangelical Christian, or my church is an evangelical church. What's happening there? Part of what's happening is that one is implying that there is, because the root here, of course, is gospel, gospel. One is saying that me and my own people, however defined, we are the gospel Christians. We have the gospel in ways that those not gospel Christians don't. There's an evangelical faith, there's a gospel faith, there's a true Christian faith, and then there's a lesser Christian faith. And what's remarkable to me is who that lesser Christian is, who the primary target is for that move, varies across time and across evangelical communities. Those who get called liberals are certainly often a target, anti-communists, especially at different points in 20th century history in the 40s and 50s, especially. But that move is really consistent. And right, I have said elsewhere, I don't say in the book, but I've said elsewhere that there is no feature more defining, no characteristic that runs deeper within these self-identified evangelical communities than the impulse to exclude. And the very self-appellation, the very naming, does that work. I'm less interested in defining what an evangelical is and more interested in talking about what work does evangelical do. And that's the work it does, which is why everyone's fighting over it, because everyone wants to have this tool, this rhetorical tool for positioning themselves in their own within the bounds of true Christianity and their chosen enemies, whoever they are, outside of those bounds.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that that shape of the rhetoric, right, that you're identifying as this is if not it's at least a pervasive feature of evangelical communities, is present even in the gay evangelical communities, right? This is part of what, when you talk about MCC, MCC, especially in the 70s, is ecumenical. It's a very religiously diverse organization.
For sure.
And yet there was definitely a strong presence of evangelicals. Some would argue, at least in the earlier days, Pentecostals and evangelicals were a dominant force in much of MCC. And you identify, right, that the way we know that is by these discourses that come up in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, where people are policing the boundaries of certain Christian concepts, right? What it means to be a true Christian, even within this gay Christian context.
Yeah, and this is what's really remarkable to me. And one of the more sobering parts of the history of evangelical gay activism is just how invested some of these people become. And I don't even need to say invested in terms of their minds. Who knows what's going on in their minds and hearts? But the words they use, what they publish, does a lot of the same work. And I do borrow in the book, I invoke Michael Warner, The Trouble with Normal, classic text in queer studies, queer theory by now, something to the effect of Michael Warner says that the good gay, capital G, the good gay is never invoked without its shadow side, the bad queer. And the way I put it in the book is that even evangelical gay activists have queer outsiders. And this is part of what makes them so evangelical. Evangelicalism, I argue, in that sixth part especially, as we talk about the progressive evangelicals, self-identified progressive evangelicals, who also land on an anti-gay position. There's this distinctive need in progressive and conservative circles alike, I argue, to make queer outsiders.
So can we talk about that section? Because I have a feeling, I think probably a lot of people who first engaged with your work or engaged with your work for the first time are probably very drawn to your analysis of how conservative evangelical discourse on homosexuality is changing. It's vulnerable, right? They're trying to figure out how to get to the anti-gay position because there's all these counter arguments to that. But that last section of the book on progressive evangelicals is actually really important. So can you talk about how that demonstrates this evangelical dynamic that you're talking about, this rhetoric, this discourse, and why it was important to include it in the book?
Yeah, it looks like different things for different folks. What was remarkable to me was to see how certain progressive evangelical leaders in these like evangelical feminist organizations, the Evangelical Women's Caucus in the 70s into the 80s, as well as folks like Ron Sider at Evangelicals for Social Action, later Christians for Social Action, to see the ways in which some of these people would deploy the exact same rhetorical tactics, the same tricks that had been used against them by politically conservative evangelicals. So Ron Sider knows that when Francis Schaeffer calls his position unbiblical, right, Ron Sider both knows how to respond to Francis Schaeffer with that, no, let me tell you what the Bible really says, but he also knows the problems, the hermeneutical, right? The more conceptual problems of what's happening. And at the same time, he will turn around, he will jostle over here and deploy that exact same rhetoric against people like Lisa Scansoni and Virginia Mollengot, who he has been working with for years, calling their gay activism unbiblical in the same rhetorical fashion. Again, I have no idea what's in Ron Sider's mind and heart. I do know that precisely at this period where even the progressive evangelical movement is solidifying into this largely anti-queer, not entirely, but largely anti-queer, anti-gay movement, it is becoming increasingly advantageous for that movement to side with a growing anti-gay movement within evangelicalism and frankly in America at large, at least according to polls at this time from the late 70s through the 80s because of the AIDS crisis primarily, right? America's becoming more homophobic, becoming more anti-gay during this time. Evangelicalism is a part of that. And progressive evangelicals are choosing to be a part of that. They are choosing to build their movement for some pretty understandable reasons, to be sure. I can empathize with much of what these progressive evangelicals are doing or navigating, but what they're doing is building their movement on the body of the queer outsider.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so powerfully put, right? Because one of the things you're showing in this book is how this idea that Christianity and specifically evangelicalism is inherently anti-queer, like that's kind of a branding exercise, right? Like there's a way that people associate that. There's a process by which that brand was created. And progressive evangelicals siding with conservatives on this, even when it went against a lot of their political sensibilities, their theological sensibilities, the way they approach the Bible, it was kind of haunting, and I think also kind of have lessons for today, right? For how like liberal and leftist movements try to build allies across lines of difference, and who are willing to sell out in order to do that.
Yeah, because where you mentioned sellout, because we are recording, I am not going to say all that I could say. What I will say is that some people who have in the last 15 years, 10 years, become gay affirming in these circles, in evangelical circles and progressive evangelical circles. I know that some of these leaders learned nothing in 2015 that they did not already learn in 1978, 79. About the Bible, about theology, about right the same evangelical gay activists today or evangelical adjacent gay activists today who they will allow to write for them now or who they will lift up now. Those people's predecessors were also partners, were also collaborators with some of these people. And again, they've learned nothing new. So the history here is something else.
Yeah. So we are at 8:50, and I want to leave time for questions. I have one more question, William, for you, but I'll wrap it into a question from an audience member. Um, The audience member says, I do wonder how William sees how the AIDS crisis affected the discourse. It seems to have supercharged it. And my question was, so what happens to this world of evangelical gay activism?
Yeah, HIV/AIDS matters for evangelical gay activism circles. It matters for anti-gay evangelicalism. And of course, it's just a part of the broader story of religion and sexuality in America. As I said toward the end here just now, the nation becomes more afraid, becomes more anti-gay during these years. Evangelical gay activism splinters and decreases in significance for a number of reasons that I talk about in the book. The AIDS crisis is one of those reasons, especially in the MCC. And I cite here, again, this is work that LGBTQ RAN has done, vital work that they've done. Reverend Frida Smith is a wonderful oral history that LGBTQ RAN has recorded, and she talks about phase one in the MCC, 70s into the 80s, is just clashes, it's just conflict, right? It's our evangelical folks in the MCC fighting with the liberal folks, and there are these other voices, and it's all just clashes all the time, all the time, all the time. And then there was AIDS. And in her words, we didn't have time to do anything but bury our dead. There were congregations burying a third of their members. Um, and not to minimize here, right? Many of you know this better than I do, and Steve Peters is, of course, a part of this book. And other people have shown the ways in which, in some ways, it takes the MCC time as a denomination and different MCC communities time to respond to the AIDS crisis. So some people are doing plenty of things besides burying their dead. But it was hard to, collaborate with some of these evangelical gay activists. It was hard to focus on reaching evangelicalism at large when you've got to figure out where to bury your own. So that is an important factor, as I see it, in the decline of evangelical gay activism. It's also the case, the last thing I'll say about this for now, what happened in the 80s, from 1980, 81 on, is that some evangelical publications go from talking about evangelicalism, homosexuality, and the Bible a lot, including acknowledging people like Blair, like Ralph Blair, like Virginia Mollenkott a lot, to not talking about biblical exegesis kind of at all when they talk about homosexuality. And two things help evangelical publications do this. One is AIDS, the other is the ex-gay movement. So what happens is, right, you can stop as an anti-gay evangelical publication, you can kind of stop engaging and risking drawing attention to the hermeneutical diversity, complexity between you and your enemies, but enemies who use the same hermeneutical tools as you. This is very risky, of course. And what evangelicals realize they can do is they can just kind of point a somber finger at AIDS and say, this is what happens. Or they can say, hey, look, gay people can become straight. And of course, the value, the preferability of straightness is taken for granted among the vast majority of their audiences at that time. And so they can safely ignore what evangelical gay activists are doing and saying, as there's a larger turn happening in religion and sexuality and politics in the US for sure, but also as the AIDS crisis is giving them something else to point at.
Yeah, the point about the ex-gay movement was a fascinating one in the book. And I think it also, right, it helps evangelicals avoid the kind of really hard, like, ideological question: what is a homosexual? How do you define it? When does one become one? Right. And it doesn't matter if you can not be that. So it's a kind of way to sidestep, like, one of the hardest questions you have to answer theologically if you accept the notion that people are born gay. And just to add to I think the way your insight over the impact of the AIDS crisis, I was having this conversation with some scholars recently about, I don't think we scholars of American religion, scholars of religion and sexuality, have fully absorbed and understood the impact of the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s, not just in decimating queer communities, but in shifting the politics of sex within churches, right? Like, it's a moment where, like, so many people were dying. And even if it wasn't their own communities, right? People knew somebody, it was their friends, it was their family members. And so when you have that much pain going on, and you have this, like, one set of people who are saying the most awful things and doing the most awful things to stand in the way, I think a lot of people saw that and want to know part of that, right? And so there's this way I've seen in my archives of queer communities being less receptive to the types of arguments that evangelical gay activists were making in the 70s. Right? Like, you see less God talk in queer communities in the 90s. And I think it's partly because it's a reaction to the pain that they experienced with the AIDS crisis. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true.
Such that somebody like Ralph Blair would and Virginia Mollicott would find less receptivity after that moment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think one could zoom out beyond the history of evangelical gay activism that I'm telling here, but the role of religious institutions, individuals, languages, practices, styles in the movement for queer liberation in the
Yeah.
60s, 70s.
In the 70s, yeah. Yeah.
The MCC is the largest LGBTQ organization in the world.
Oh yeah,
in the late
they're
70s into the
all
90s.
The marches,
they're actually
yes.
growing,
Leading
even as we're talking about AIDS and death, right? The MCC is growing during this time.
Yeah.
But that role, for reasons, at least in part, like you just gave, Danny, the centrality of religion, whether people like it or not, and of course plenty do not, the centrality of religion to the gay liberation movement, to larger movements for LGBTQ rights, in the 70s especially will look different and will decline on the other side of the AIDS crisis, I think, at least in part for the reasons you're gesturing to.
Yeah. Okay. We have time for one more question, and it's a good one. Where are we, queer believers in God today, in the face of white Christian nationalism? And maybe to broaden out this question, is there some connection to what the lesson you're trying to teach us in this book?
Yeah, when it comes to the dominance of white supremacy in evangelical and other American Christian communities, the dominance of nationalism, of Christian supremacy, many different kinds of queer outsiders, right? Yeah, and I was struck when I was looking at doing my deep dives into evangelical publications in the 40s, 50s, before these things were searchable. Some of these things I was sitting in this archive, just flipping through all these periodicals. The term that I came up with to use in the book to describe evangelicalism in this early period, and this is a white Protestant nationalist movement. And by that I mean there is a deep-rooted hostility toward the civil rights movement in the 50s and then beyond as well. I mean, there is a deep opposition to immigration, as others have chronicled. There is a deep hostility toward fear of Catholics. This is related to the xenophobia, related to the fear of immigrants, right? Of Catholics in politics. And there is a deep, right, I would say broadly speaking, I talk plenty about anti-communism in the book, but there's this larger, maybe theological, but certainly social and political, I would say anti-collectivism embedded in the evangelical movement in the 20th century US. And I have to think that that anti-collectivism lives on in various ways, including in how queer outsiders get made within evangelical communities. And I think that is very relevant to the conversations we're having about white Christian nationalism today.
No, that's so interesting. And there's a way in which these patterns persist, right? And the rhetorical and discursive techniques of the past come up today, but with queer outsiders who can be lots of things, can be immigrants, can be whoever it is, where the outsider is going to be.
I'll go ahead and take, if it's all right, Danny, unless you have a closing word, I'll go ahead and take Isaiah's comment. What I say to, again, these days I'm speaking about this book. I've spent 5 years writing this dissertation, speaking mostly to scholars, and then I don't take for granted that I'm speaking to scholars anymore when I'm talking about this book, at least not in the last couple of months. So a key takeaway for me from this book, and of course there are different ones for queer folks, for straight folks, for Christians, for not Christians, evangelicals, and not. But I want everyone to know after reading this book that evangelical, anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ positions as we know them today had to be made. And that means they can be made differently. For scholars, we need to be much more intentional about robustly historicizing positions on gender and sexuality, particularly anti-LGBTQ positions in the religious communities we study, whatever they are. Those positions aren't just there as if they are inherent or timeless. Again, they have to be made. And the last thing I'll say, I know I've got one more minute here. I am cards on the table, right? I am not interested in getting more people to talk about faith in the same ways that these subjects talk about faith. I'm not interested in making more queer evangelicals. And I do want all kinds of queer people coming from all kinds of places, coming from all kinds of communities, religious and otherwise. I want them to know that they have a history. I want to know that regardless of what their opponents say, their oppressors say, they are not the first ones. They have a history, and that means they can have a future.
That is a beautiful note on which to end. And I'll plug the book one more time. As you can see, there's so much to learn and so much to explore and talk about. We could do this for hours if we wanted to get into all the themes of the book. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Mark, we will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Danny and William, for this fascinating and inspiring discussion. And thanks to all of you who participated and offered comments and questions. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. And if you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar, a collaboration with New Ways Ministries, will feature Catholic journalist Maxwell Kuzma interviewing author Tyler Bieber on his book, Against the Current, Father Tom Odo and the New American Catholic. Sign up on the website to get the Zoom link to join this program coming up on July 23rd. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations will hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. You can either go to giveq.org, that's giveq.org on your phone, tablet, or laptop, or click on the donate button on the LGBTQRAN homepage. With your credit card in hand, it only takes a couple of minutes to make a gift, and your gift will make a difference. On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Danny and William for their time and their enlightening discussion. Good night to all.